here on site. So you will see that being upheld right in the very first sessions, the keynote sessions. And for these sessions, may I welcome Dr. Nguyễn Hùng Sơn, Vice President of the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam, to chair the sessions. Please welcome Dr. Sơn.
Well, good morning, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. As introduced, we are now proceeding to the keynote sessions. And on these sessions, we are absolutely delighted to be joined by three very prominent speakers. We will have His Excellency Mr. Kevin Rudd, President and CEO of the Asia Society, President of the Asia Society Policy Institute, and former Prime Minister of Australia from 2007 to 2010, and briefly in 2013. We'll also be joined by His Excellency Mr. Marty Nitalagawan. Dr. Marty Nitalagawan served as Foreign Minister of Indonesia between 2009 and 2014. He is the author of Does ASEAN Matter? A View from Within. And he is a member of the UN Secretary General High-Level Advisory Board on Mediation, among others. We'll also be joined by Her Excellency Amanda Miley. Amanda Miley was appointed Minister for Asia at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office on 16 September 2021. Amanda was previously Minister without portfolio at the Cabinet Office from 13 February 2020 to 15 September 2021, Treasurer of Her Majesty Household, Deputy Chief Whip from July 2019 to February 2020, and Assistant Government Whip from January 2018 to July 2019. So without any further ado, please welcome our three distinguished keynote speakers. I would like to first of all invite Excellency Kevin Rudd to deliver your remarks. And we are delighted that the distinguished keynote speakers have agreed to stay on after their remarks to interact with the audience. So Excellency Kevin Rudd, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. My understanding is that I'm to speak according to this for 15 minutes, and then we're having a 15-minute discussion. So I will stay with you as long as I can before I retreat to my requirements here in Singapore, where I'm a delegate to the New Economy Forum hosted by Bloomberg. First of all, to our friends in Vietnam, can I extend my greetings? I have a deep affection for the people of Vietnam. I've been to your country many times, and I'm pleased in particular about a decision I took as Prime Minister to provide the core funding for what then became the Ca Lan Friendship Bridge, a very big construction project across the Mekong for our friends in Vietnam. And I was glad to see it opened in 2018. It was Australia's single largest development assistance program. Good to see also my great friend Marty Nitalagawan. Marty and I have done many things together around the world, most of them good. He is a friend and colleague and a great contributor to the debate about ASEAN's future as a practitioner, but also as a scholar. Let me make three sets of remarks for this conference. One concerns the state of US-China relations as it impacts the South China Sea. Two, the consequences of the state of US-China relations for ASEAN. And then three, recent developments within the South China Sea itself and where that leads to the future for ASEAN solidarity and centrality. On the first question, which is US-China, the truth is, and perhaps the uncomfortable truth, is that we are now in a period of significant strategic competition between these two global powers. And there are three basic reasons for this. They are structural. One is China's rising power, economic, military, technological, and as a consequence, it alters the material or objective balance of power between China and the United States within the region, and of course between China and other countries within the region. The second structural factor at work has been a change in Chinese strategy since Xi Jinping became China's paramount leader at the end of 2012. I've observed this over the last 9 years, and Xi Jinping's explicit rejection of Deng Xiaoping's previous strategy of 韬光养晦,绝不当头, hide your strength, bide your time, never take the lead, to a more forceful and assertive Chinese foreign and security policy to advance what China defines as its core interests and its central values, has been clear and plain to China's neighbors in Southeast Asia, China's neighbors in Northeast Asia, as well as China's partners around the rest of the world. The third structural factor driving the dynamics of the US-China relationship has been the US strategic response to China's rising power and the adjustment in China's central strategy. And we've seen that most particularly reflected with the determination of the new US national security strategy at the end of the first year of the Trump administration, November of 2017, and America's new, as it were, mega doctrine, macro doctrine of strategic competition against the People's Republic of China. And despite the fact that we've had a change in administration 1 year ago, the essential characteristics of this strategic competition as defined by the United States as its governing principles around its overall strategy on China has not changed. We will soon see the production of the US national security strategy between now, I believe, and the end of this year, together with a range of other accompanying authoritative documents, some public, many not, which will give us a greater insight into the contours of US strategic response to the China dynamic. This, of course, brings us to what has happened most recently in the last couple of days in the summit between Xi Jinping and President Biden. My overall simple analysis is as follows. US-China relations have been in free fall since 2018 through the trade war, through the pandemic, and through a range of other geopolitical tensions, not least of which is the South China Sea, but also Taiwan, the East China Sea, and the Sino-Indian border. And so, as a consequence of that, I believe that both China's leader, Xi Jinping, and President Biden reached a conclusion in recent months that it was not in their interests, either China's interests or the United States' interests, to see a further collapse in political and diplomatic capital in the US-China relationship and the need to restabilize that relationship at a manageable level. And hence the summit. The summit, if you like, in my best description, represents a tactical pause in the downward spiral in the relationship. Secondly, however, the strategic competition between the two countries will continue. It will, however, continue in a manner which will have better machinery for keeping the relationship within what the two sides now describe as guardrails of the relationship. This approach is consistent with what I have long described as the need for a doctrine of managed strategic competition between China and the United States, which recognizes strategic red lines and constructs guardrails around them, accepts the reality of strategic competition across the rest of national security policy, foreign policy, trade, investment, technology, and human rights. But thirdly, also creates political space for areas of bilateral and multilateral collaboration between China and the United States as well. I believe that is probably where we have got to, but we should not mistake the positive response to the summit as meaning a fundamental strategic change in the nature of the competitive relationship between the two countries. It, however, creates better mechanisms, channels of diplomatic communication, and understandings between the two countries to prevent crisis, conflict, and war by accident. I said I'd touch on a second area, which is the implications for this for ASEAN. I have been a lifelong supporter of ASEAN. Many people have criticized ASEAN. I have never criticized it. But the simple reason is it has achieved an extraordinary level by way of preventing countries which were historically adversaries from going to war against each other, and as a consequence, creating across wider Southeast Asia a zone of stability, which has enabled extraordinary regional economic growth to occur over the last half century. And the alternative, frankly, would have been disastrous for the region and for the world. However, the dynamics of US-China strategic competition make ASEAN into what I describe as the strategic swing state between China and the United States. It's not a term which our friends in ASEAN necessarily welcome, and probably Marty least of all, but I simply use it in the terms of the way in which both Beijing and Washington see Southeast Asia and ASEAN in general. In other words, is ASEAN as an aggregation of 10 Southeast Asian polities and economies moving more in the direction of China's sphere of strategic influence, or the reverse in the case of the United States? Of course, ASEAN has its own autonomy and ASEAN will make its own choices, but it would be wrong for me to describe it in terms other than that when the region is looked at through the lens of both Beijing and Washington themselves. The view from ASEAN capitals will be more nuanced and complex and differentiated than that. Geopolitically, of course, ASEAN confronts the reality, as the Deputy Minister referred to before, of emerging new regional security institutions and political institutions. The Quad, of course, is one of them, and the Quad has gone from a concept to a political reality and prospectively a strategic reality, really in a quite short period of time. The triggering event, in my judgment, was the Sino-Indian border clash of June-July 2020, when India's historical reservations about it confirming the Quad as a useful, comprehensive piece of strategic architecture which India could be comfortably associated with, those reservations changed after those border clashes. So the Quad is there. Most recently, of course, we've had a further innovation in relation to AUKUS, linking the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom. ASEAN, seeking its own strategic autonomy, will be at one level concerned by these developments because they will cause Southeast Asia to become even more the focus of external great power competition. At a different level, however, various people within ASEAN and various individual states within ASEAN privately may welcome the balancing effect which the emergence of both the Quad and AUKUS provide. And by a balancing mechanism, you also create greater political space for ASEAN to then exercise the strategic political autonomy that it actually has sought all along. At an economic level, let me make this point. The giant missing element of US Asia-Pacific strategy still lies in trade and the broader economy. The decision by the United States under both Republican and now Democrat administrations not to proceed with the Trans-Pacific Partnership is regrettable. Nonetheless, China, sensing the strategic and political opportunity, has itself now applied to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership. China, of course, has already become a signature to the APEC-wide arrangement, which is the RCEP arrangement, a lesser grade free trade arrangement than the TPP. And so therefore we have China as a member of RCEP and the United States not. We have China as an applicant for the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the United States not. And we have China's growing global and regional economic footprint, which now goes not just to trade, but also to foreign direct investment flows and also to broader capital markets. So the challenge for the United States in terms of its long-term strategy in Southeast Asia and wider Asia and the world is the extent to which the United States wishes to resume global leadership of trade liberalization and sustain its position of global economic leadership more broadly. That is the challenge lies in the in-tray, not just of this administration under President Biden, who understands the nature of this challenge very well, but in particular, the protectionist nature of the United States Congress, which arbitrates the politics of American global trade engagement. My final set of remarks before I turn the floor back to you is, of course, on the South China Sea explicitly. China, of course, within the South China Sea, has been adapting its own strategy. China, as we will have observed, has for some time now not explicitly engaged in further island reclamation. However, China's strategic focus has in fact changed to the evolution of a series of joint resource development agreements, which it seeks to prosecute with the various claimant states to the region. I think these are important developments to observe. China's long-term strategic aspirations in terms of its territorial claims, in my judgment, has not changed. China's tactical decisions to move from overt reclamation to, in fact, a more diplomatic approach, both through joint resource development agreements and engagement with the Code of Conduct negotiations with ASEAN counterparts, represents a significant tactical shift by China. But China's strategic ambitions, as I read the Chinese strategic literature clearly, have not changed. Therefore, to conclude, what does that mean for ASEAN and Southeast Asia? Two very simple observations for the future, and they are these. What is paramount in terms of ASEAN's long-term interests for the individual member states and for the institution as a whole, but also for ASEAN's overall negotiating posture with China over the future of the Code of Conduct, the future of joint resource development agreements, but most critically on the future of the ultimate claims to sovereignty, is for ASEAN to maintain its political unity. To lose ASEAN's political unity on such a critical question as the South China Sea, I argue would be catastrophic for the future of ASEAN. And therefore, I regard that as a paramount concern for deliberations both at this conference, but also our friends and colleagues in the various chancelleries and foreign ministries across the 10 member states of ASEAN. And finally, the organizing principle for that pan-ASEAN solidarity must continue to be, as the Deputy Minister said before, the principles of international law, international maritime law, the law of the sea in particular, including the deliberations already delivered by relevant international institutions, such as the Permanent Court of Arbitration. I think, therefore, if there is a political imperative to sustain unity, and furthermore, to anchor that unity in the enduring universal principles of international law, then in fact, ASEAN can carve out for itself a robust future on this most sensitive of strategic, territorial, and political topics. Thank you so much. I'll return the chair to you. As I said, I'll remain with you as long as I can before I must attend to other conference commitments here in Singapore.
Well, thank you very much, Excellency Kevin Rudd, for your very interesting and in-depth remark. I now would like to invite Pak Mati Nitalagawan. I believe there's a lot of reference to ASEAN and how ASEAN needs to maintain political unity and cohesiveness. I wish you could comment on that too, Pak Mati. So without any further ado, Pak Mati, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And thank you to the Academy for inviting me to share some thoughts and to learn essentially from the exchanges that are to take place throughout today. I am speaking just after my dear friend, Kevin, whom I have long admired during his time in office and since, for his incredible thought leadership, contribution that he has made to our region, and like to acknowledge that right at the forefront. But not least of all, I'd like to begin by expressing appreciation for Vietnam's role all throughout, specific to the South China Sea in terms of supporting the various ASEAN-led initiatives on the matter, but also the wider region as a whole. Vietnam's membership in ASEAN have been transformative in helping solidify the idea of an ASEAN 10 that is at peace with one another, and and enjoying a trust, strategic trust rather than a trust deficit. The immediate subject at hand, as I understand it, for the conference is the South China Sea, though the actual session that we are in at the moment speaks of the Indo-Pacific. In that connection, I'd like to begin by recalling or providing substance, perhaps, to ASEAN's engagement on the South China Sea, which was as early as in the early 90s, when ASEAN adopted the so-called Manila Declaration in 1992. And I do remember as a foreign ministry officials when Indonesia began to broach the idea of having a regional management of the potential for conflict on the South China Sea. Many at the time really expressed had question mark whether this was an entirely necessary and useful thing to do. But at the time, Indonesia and subsequently ASEAN and subsequently all of us in Southeast Asia recognized what we are about was about managing the potentials for conflict, about looking far ahead and being anticipatory, trying to transform what was the negative dynamic that was prevalent and trying to transform it in a more positive manner. Hence, as all of you would be familiar, we've had decades of ASEAN-China process, wherein we had the original Manila Declaration of '92, the 2002 DOC, and the ongoing efforts on the COC. The point that I wanted to make is that efforts of this type, management of conflict situations or transforming potential for conflict into one of cooperation, it is a process requiring persistent and continuous diplomatic efforts. And this is what ASEAN has been doing over all these past decades, not only on the South China Sea, but in the wider context in the Indo-Pacific as well. Although the term Indo-Pacific has only most recently become rather fashionable or rather popular, for ASEAN, as a matter of state practice, although we may not have used the term in the past, we have always had an Indo-Pacific perspective. Hence, for instance, the type of cooperative processes that we introduced was always beyond Southeast Asia, beyond East Asia even. And the most obvious manifestations would be the ASEAN Regional Forum, which encompasses countries far beyond Southeast Asia and East Asia, and the East Asia Summit, which includes Australia, obviously, New Zealand, and India, once again manifesting ASEAN's Indo-Pacific outlook or Indo-Pacific perspective. The question is whether all these modalities as ASEAN has introduced and processes, whether they remain fit for purpose given the challenges that we are facing today. The so-called return to the age of geopolitics, perhaps. And this is, I think, where ASEAN must devote a great deal of attention and effort on. The South China Sea is only one facet or one manifestation of what to me would be a recurring challenge of not only an intra-Southeast Asia or intra-regional disputes, but also one that can be magnified by the projection of so-called major power rivalries onto the scene. Kevin just now already described in depth the state of US-China dynamics, and I don't wish to add much to what Kevin had said, except to simply widen our recognition that when we speak of geopolitical dynamics that ASEAN must try to manage and contend with, it is not only obviously US-China, the India-China dynamic, as Kevin also had mentioned, is becoming increasingly problematic, not only on their border disputes, but also on the maritime dimension as well. Bay of Bengal, the Andaman Sea, perhaps may one day see more intensified difficult dynamics between those countries. Not only India and China, we have as well, of course, situation in the East China Sea, the dynamic between China and Japan, and the +3 dynamics in Northeast Asia. In essence, when ASEAN reflect on geopolitical dynamic, it must be a comprehensive approach. It cannot simply be determined by the dynamic, the US-China dynamic alone, because we must find some relevance essentially for ASEAN amidst all this situation. Not only the deepening of tensions and animosity in the traditional security field, but the ever widening area within which these competitions are being played out: technology, trade, finance, and even in areas where we would expect countries to collaborate, such as health, for instance, in the case of the pandemic. And therefore, the way I've been thinking about these matters is that what can actually ASEAN do apart from describing situation, apart from expressing concern, apart from appealing to all the parties concerned to exercise restraint, apart from hoping that ASEAN is left alone and not be forced to choose. I think ASEAN's ambitions must be far more than that. Autonomy is not an end by itself. If ASEAN was to play a driving seat role, it must have a clear sense of direction, where it would like to take to earn, how it would like to earn this centrality. And in this connection, it is quite encouraging that in recent years, we have seen at least ASEAN recognizing the need to have an Indo-Pacific outlook as presented in the formal document that it had issued. But the question is how one can proceed beyond an outlook. How can ASEAN provide meaningful policy impact on what is now ongoing? I know that there are some within ASEAN who may have different views in terms of how ASEAN should be. There are people who, a school of thought, who feels that these sort of issues are not for ASEAN to deal with, that it is beyond ASEAN, because ASEANs are not, comparatively speaking, powerful states, so to speak. ASEAN's variation in its foreign policy outlook may lead countries to succumb to the notion that it is far too difficult to have a common views. But I do believe that ultimately, ASEAN member states and beyond ASEAN share common interests in trying to use the Kevin's term, to stabilize the geopolitical tensions, but all to strike what I would use the term an equilibrium in the current situation. So in my view, it is important for ASEAN to have a very precise definition of the nature of the problem that we are facing. For instance, the prevalence of trust deficit. For instance, the absence of a crisis management capacity in our region. We have plenty of scenarios whereby a minor incident may quickly develop into a major crisis unintended. And this is where ASEAN perhaps can contribute, how it can promote greater confidence among countries of the region. For instance, the notion of ASEAN pushing and calling for a renewal of the peaceful intent of countries in the Indo-Pacific, that irrespective of the fact that these countries are have fundamentally different positions on many issues, I think we can rally around the notion that notwithstanding, there should be a commitment that these type of problems can be resolved by peaceful or diplomatic means. We have had the presidents through the TAC. We have had the presidents through the East Asia Summit Bali Principles. But I think at this time, especially following on or trying to capture the spirit of the recent US-China summit, it would be well, I think, for ASEAN to capture that spirit of early signs of some kind of commitment to stabilize the situation by pushing for a renewal of political commitment at the highest level to peaceful settlement of disputes. And my second point is on crisis management capacity. Here is where we have a lacune. There is not a capacity in our region that can deal with fast emerging crisis in a time-sensitive and a relevant manner, despite the fact that we have so many processes in our region. And having that kind of relevant and timely capacity, I think, is extremely important, which leads me once again to the South China Sea equation. In a way, the way ASEAN has tried to manage the situation on the South China Sea provides like a microcosm, almost like a template on how it can also try to manage the wider region as well. Building trust, building habit of communication, trying to instill predictable behavior through this long negotiated code of conduct. So I think it is well for ASEAN to try to extrapolate and to try to widen its efforts beyond the South China Sea theater itself. At the same time, I am a little bit disappointed, a little bit, if not despondent, by the lack of, the relatively slow progress on the code of conduct. There is a real risk that events on the ground may outpace the diplomatic processes. And as Kevin had said, I think it is critically important for ASEAN, without any hesitation, to speak as one on this matter and negotiate or consult, if that is the right term, with China on the code of conduct from a position of unity in terms of their commitment, not necessarily to resolve the actual dispute at hand, but at least to ensure that the situation does not get any worse. But thank you once again to the Academy for inviting me to share some of my thoughts on this occasion, and deepest of appreciation once again to Vietnam for its leadership that it has demonstrated over the years in helping bring consolidate peace and security in our region. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you very much, Excellency Martin Nitalagawan, for your sentimental remarks on ASEAN's and ASEAN's role. And please stay tuned for the interactions with the audience later. Now I'd like to invite Excellency Amanda Miley to convey her remarks through a pre-recorded video, please.
Hello, thank you for inviting me to this important conference, which the UK is proud to support. And thank you to the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam for putting together such a broad and useful agenda. I join you at an exciting time for the UK's relationship with partners in Southeast Asia. We share many priorities and interests, from maritime security to climate change and free trade, so we're working ever more closely together. In August, we became ASEAN's first dialogue partner in more than 25 years, a landmark moment. The Foreign Secretary visited Malaysia, Thailand and Indonesia just last week to strengthen our economic and security ties. I visited the Philippines and Singapore for the same reasons last month. In Singapore, I witnessed the impressive sight of the visiting UK Carrier Strike Group. It is flying the flag for global Britain, a maritime nation and a free trading nation. Like our South Asian counterparts, we rely heavily on the South China Sea for transporting our imports and exports. And like ASEAN, we view the sea as vitally important to peace, stability and prosperity. That's why we recently signed a new maritime security partnership with Vietnam. And as a new dialogue partner, we reaffirm our support for ASEAN centrality and ASEAN's outlook on the Indo-Pacific. We are keen to explore further cooperation, particularly in the areas of maritime security and safety that the outlook identifies. The UK has a right and duty to uphold international law and an obligation to protect the rules-based international system. That's why my predecessor set out the UK's legal position on the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, and the South China Sea for the first time in 2020 to our own Parliament. Our position is long-standing. Our commitment is to the international law, in particular to UNCLOS, and to the freedom of navigation and overflight. We do not take a position on competing sovereignty claims. We are clear that UNCLOS is the legal framework for all activities in the ocean and seas. Our commitment to upholding the Convention is a global matter. We will continue to raise concerns with other nations when their interpretation of UNCLOS differs from ours. That's why we have objected to China's claims based on the so-called 9-dash line and offshore archipelagos concept as being unfounded in UNCLOS. We agree with the findings of the 2016 South China Sea Arbitral Award in this respect. Like others, we are very concerned by reports of militarization, coercion, and intimidation in the South China Sea. We urge all parties to resolve their disputes peacefully through existing legal mechanisms, particularly UNCLOS. We agree with ASEAN that it is important for the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties to be fully implemented, and we hope that an effective and substantive code of conduct for the South China Sea will be concluded in line with international law, in particular UNCLOS. There is another strong reason for working closely with our ASEAN partners here to protect marine environment. This is a critical priority for the UK as leader of the Global Ocean Alliance and hosts of COP26. The ocean and seas play a unique and irreplaceable role in regulating our climate and keeping us healthy. They absorb carbon dioxide and heat and provide half of the oxygen we breathe, not to mention producing the fish that billions of people depend on as their main source of protein. Globally, a third of marine mammals are at risk of extinction, and we're filling the ocean with plastic that is set to treble from 2015 to 2025. So we must protect the South China Sea along with all our marine resources. But it is suffering untold harm from overfishing and dredging for the construction of artificial features. Fish stocks have dropped by a third over the last 30 years. At COP26, the UK government set out our commitment to working with international partners, including ASEAN friends, to protect at least 30% of the global ocean by 2030. We also committed to ensuring conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And we are determined to make the most of the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development and scale up the policy and finance that will turn our ambition into action. Early this year, we launched our £500 million Blue Planet Fund. This will support developing countries, including in Southeast Asia, to protect marine environment and reduce poverty. It will also help them reduce the damage done to our ocean and manage the marine resources. COP26 also reinforced the importance of littoral states being able to use their exclusive economic zones for blue economic activity, shifting away from fossil fuels. Offshore wind is essential to the future energy mix in the South China Sea, replacing oil and gas to meet new emissions goals. So I welcome the ambition of Vietnam and other Southeast Asian nations announced during the summit to reach net zero by 2050. On this and on so much more, we will continue to work closely with our partners in Southeast Asia. It's in all of our interest to promote a stable, prosperous and environmentally sustainable South China Sea. This is how we will protect each other in the long term and boost security, trade and the rule of law. I wish you a successful conference.
Well, Thank you very much, Excellency Amanda Miley. Now we have some spare minutes left, and we are glad that Pak Mati Nitalagawan is still with us. Excellency Kevin Rudd unfortunately had to leave for another event. So I would like to now open the floor for Q&A, and I'm glad that Pak Mati would be happy to entertain your questions. So I'd like to invite distinguished excellencies and delegates from this room, as well as 4 other rooms in this building where participants are residing. Also, I'd like to invite online participants. If you have a question, please forward it to me through the chat box or Q&A box. Okay, I got a question here, and the question is rightly to you, Pak Mati. You said earlier that the region is returning to the age of geopolitics, and there are a lot of questions on whether ASEAN is fit for the purpose. So in your opinion, how ASEAN should retool itself in order to make it better fit for the purpose, especially in the context of the return of geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for that very important question. In my view, it is not necessarily retooling itself, because in some ways, the wherewithal, the capacities actually already exist, because during the years of relatively conducive geopolitical environment, ASEAN worked hard at developing all kinds of processes and introducing norms and principles to safeguard the region's peace and security. All of you are familiar with the ASEAN Plus dialogue partner processes, the ASEAN Regional Forum that I mentioned, the ASEAN East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Maritime Forum, including expanded ASEAN Maritime Forum, etc. So the capacities exist, the institutions, so to speak. I guess one of the challenge that we face is how we can make those institutions, how ASEAN can actually utilize those institutions and make use of them as situations develop. For instance, the East Asia Summit, it has been meant to be a leaders level process to discuss strategic issues. And I wonder now, as it's currently being practiced, whether it has become too regular and too routine, in the sense that meetings are essentially annual in nature, and when there are crises that occur that demands leaders' collective attention, a forum such as the East Asia Summit have not really been felt its impact and its influence. That is why, in my view, it is not a question of creating new institutions, because that can be really a long and time-consuming process, but really to empower what we already have, the ASEAN Regional Forum, the East Asia Summit, make sure that they are more timely, they are not too routine, like a conference diplomacy, but really having this capacity that I mentioned before, a crisis management capacity. For instance, just case studies, when the dynamics on the Korean Peninsula in recent years sort of show some promise. Was the ASEAN Regional Forum of relevance during the entire process in trying to lock and trying to consolidate the momentum towards peace? Of course, Vietnam and Singapore, 2 ASEAN states, hosted important summits to do with the Korean Peninsula. But ASEAN collectively, I feel, could have done more. Likewise on India and Pakistan, India and China. Again, these capacities exist. It's just a question of, are we willing to respect our own institutions' capacities and make use of them? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Pa. There's another question here. from an audience online. What is your assessments of the evolutions of ASEAN's position on the South China Sea, and especially the outcome of recent ASEAN summits on the South China Sea?
Well, as I said, as I tried to refer to before, there is a long history of ASEAN's engagement on the matter. And we shouldn't take that for granted, because obviously some of the disputing countries are fellow members of ASEAN, and other ASEAN member states are not involved on the matter at all. And yet, despite that reality, ASEAN has managed to make this a common ASEAN test case. So it is important, as Kevin and as well as tried to say earlier, for ASEAN to maintain that sense of unity, that sense of common interest on the South China Sea matter. But at the moment, there is a real risk, as I was trying to suggest, of how developments on the ground or developments at sea far outpacing the diplomatic process. And this is where there could be credibility gap between commitments on paper that are being made and the reality at sea, where there are unilateral actions, as you know, by certain countries, a certain country, to try to change the situation on the ground. And this is obviously absolutely unacceptable. And I am not obviously as well informed as I should be nowadays, but I noticed that ASEAN nowadays, when they refer to in their official document on the South China Sea, whenever there is, for instance, expression of concern, there is a qualification. It says some ASEAN members express concern. I'm not sure whether that is actually necessarily a positive thing, because then you begin to dissect separate ASEAN. There is the complete ASEAN view, and there are expression of concern that are expressed only by some ASEAN member states. So I guess this symbolism, or these words matter. Words matter, and those who study this kind of thing and draw conclusions, they can see there are potential fragility in our approach. And I think we should work harder in presenting a common view on the matter. Yeah.
Thank you, Pa. There is a question from an anonymous attendant. He says that, thank you, Excellency Mati, for your insightful remarks. Can you please share your thoughts on the impact of AUKUS on ASEAN's role in regional politics? How can ASEAN navigate in this new environment where more US-driven unilateral mechanisms such as the Quad and AUKUS might further weaken ASEAN relevance and centrality?
Well, thank you for that very, very current question. I personally believe that ASEAN should not try to sort of have a monopoly of processes in our region. I mean, it is a reality that ASEAN cannot have an exclusive status as the entity that drives, that initiates all meaningful diplomatic processes and security processes in our region. The reality has been ASEAN's centrality and ASEAN's existence have been side by side with other so-called minilaterals. Although AUKUS is the most recent example, prior to that, there were, well, ever since in the 50s, I guess, there's already the five-power defense arrangement, the bilateral security arrangement countries have with ASEAN member states have with other countries. So I think it would not be advisable for ASEAN to make it an either or, a zero sum. It's either ASEAN completely or ASEAN completely gone. But at the same time, the emergence of these processes, renewal of the Quad, the emergence of AUKUS must be a wake-up call for ASEAN. It must be. It means to me that there are certain needs, certain requirements that is not being met, that is not being solved, addressed by ASEAN. And therefore, these unmet needs find different modalities for its solution. And this is where I think ASEAN can think harder, because I do recall, for instance, the Quad. I mean, it has been in existence for many, many years. And we have all managed to put a lid on the Quad relevance, because we have really empowered the East Asia Summit, make the East Asia Summit to be the premier process, the ASEAN Regional Forum to be the premier process. But if those forums show signs of drift or even irrelevance, then security will be sought, will be looked for elsewhere. So we must, it is not fundamentally inimical to ASEAN, but at the same time, it is a wake-up call. And most of all, it is a wake-up call for us, as I think earlier speakers have mentioned. It can create an action-reaction, in terms of military modernization of military capacities, or even arms race as well. So it is not, in my view, it is not something that ASEAN can neglect.
Thank you very much, Pa. The theme of this conference, as you can see, it's looking back to a brighter future.
Yeah.
What do you think is the best lesson we can draw from the past in order to navigate into a brighter future? If I can ask you that last question.
Well, I mean, obviously we look at the past to try to draw lessons learned, but we apply it to a situation that's often not necessarily the same as in the past. But at the same time, when I think of the past vis-a-vis ASEAN, I'm reminded of how courageous and how transformative ASEAN has been. I mean, when you think about 1976, the TAC, the decision to expand ASEAN membership to become ASEAN 10, and many other important, the ASEAN Charter. These are decisions that when it was taken, there was always some within ASEAN that question, is this a sound thing? Is this something that ASEAN should be engaged in? Or the decision to begin to initiate the ASEAN community? But all those times we have been driven by, very anticipatory, over the horizon perspective. And the South China Sea management of the South China Sea is another example. So I hope, for the present, ASEAN member states and leaders should not see issues as being glass half empty, but rather glass half full. And look at the problems and make sure that ASEAN is relevant to all these problems. The ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific, for instance, in the first half of the document provides a very precise and very thoughtful definition of the nature of the problem. And then we have a number of cooperative areas. But the cooperative areas, I feel, must be in line or addresses the problems. Otherwise, it will be a solution looking for a problem, which may not be there. And to me, the most fundamental problem at the moment is one of trust deficit, the potential for miscalculation, and ASEAN must provide a response to that. And if you look at the past, ASEAN has always proved others wrong. We have always proved our resilience, our capacity to renew ourselves, to reinvent ourselves even, and I'm confident, thanks to the leadership of countries like Vietnam and others within ASEAN, the thought leadership, ASEAN will once again demonstrate its capacity to contribute to the region's peace and security. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Pak Mati. We have a lot more questions coming in and we just barely warmed up, but unfortunately the time we have for the keynote session has finished. So I'd like to, on behalf of all the Excellencies ambassadors in this room, all the participants in this building and all the attendees online to express our gratitude for your time today and for sharing your very insightful and sentimental thoughts with us.